I never thought the most devastating moment of my life would come not from losing my mother to cancer, but from my father's ice-cold voice on the phone telling me I was forbidden from attending her funeral because I had disrespected the family by choosing my career over my duties as a daughter. What I couldn't have anticipated was that 3 days later, my sister's pompous boss would look directly at me in a crowded coffee shop and say the 2 words that would change everything. "Hi, owner. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." But that moment of recognition, that single phrase that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family's financial situation, became the key that unlocked not only the truth about my mother's secret legacy, but also my path from the forgotten daughter to the woman who would expose years of manipulation and reclaim what was rightfully mine. My name is Sarah Chen, and for 28 years, I believed I was the disappointment of the family. While my younger sister Emma pursued what my father called respectable endeavors in finance, working her way up at Meridian Capital Management, I had chosen the unpredictable path of investigative journalism. My decision to work for the Seattle Tribune covering corporate fraud and environmental violations was, according to my father David Chen, a betrayal of everything our family stood for. The Chen family had always prioritized financial stability above all else. My father, a meticulous accountant who had built his practice serving Seattle's Asian American business community, viewed my career choice as not just impractical, but actively destructive to our family's reputation. Every family gathering became an opportunity for him to contrast Emma's steady advancement in corporate finance with my reckless pursuit of sensationalism, as he called my investigative work. My mother, Linda Chen, had been the buffer between my father's disapproval and my stubborn independence. She would quietly slip me articles about journalists who had exposed important corruption cases, leaving them on my childhood desk whenever I visited. When my byline appeared on a story that led to the prosecution of a construction company for dumping toxic waste in low-income neighborhoods, she had secretly laminated the newspaper clipping and kept it in her purse, though she never mentioned it when my father was present. The cancer diagnosis came 18 months before the funeral that would change everything. Aggressive, fast-moving, and devastating in its efficiency. My mother had hidden the early symptoms for months, not wanting to worry anyone, she said, though I suspected she feared my father's reaction to the medical expenses more than she feared the disease itself. During those final 18 months, I had restructured my entire life around her care. I negotiated with my editor to work remotely from Seattle, spending my days at the hospital during treatment cycles and my evenings researching stories from my laptop in sterile waiting rooms. My father had grudgingly acknowledged my presence during this period, though he made it clear that my attendance was expected rather than appreciated. Emma, meanwhile, maintained her demanding schedule at Meridian Capital, visiting on weekends and handling what she called the practical arrangements. She coordinated with insurance companies, managed medical billing, and ensured that all financial aspects of my mother's care proceeded smoothly. My father praised her efficiency constantly, often within my hearing, contrasting her valuable contributions with my mere presence. The tension between my father and me had intensified during my mother's final weeks. He disapproved of my questions about her treatment options, my research into alternative therapies, and my insistence on honest conversations about prognosis and quality of life. "You're creating unnecessary stress," he would say whenever I advocated for my mother's preferences over medical recommendations that prioritized life extension over comfort. Our final argument occurred 3 days before my mother's death. I had been pushing for hospice care at home, where she could be surrounded by her garden and her books, rather than continuing aggressive treatments that were clearly failing. My father accused me of giving up on her, of prioritizing my own convenience over her well-being, and of trying to rush her death because I was tired of caring for her. The accusation was so unfair, so completely contrary to the months I had spent advocating for her comfort and dignity, that I lost my composure entirely. I told him that his refusal to accept reality was torturing her, that his obsession with control was preventing her from dying peacefully, and that his fear of appearing to give up was more important to him than her actual wishes. He ordered me out of the hospital room. When I tried to return the next day, security informed me that David Chen had requested I be denied access to Linda Chen's room. I spent the final 48 hours of my mother's life sitting in the hospital parking garage, calling Emma repeatedly, begging her to intervene. She promised she would talk to him, but nothing changed. My mother died on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting in my car outside the hospital, waiting for visiting hours to begin so I could attempt another conversation with the nursing staff. Emma called me 20 minutes after it happened, her voice hollow with exhaustion and grief. "She's gone, Sarah. Dad was with her at the end." The funeral arrangements proceeded without my input. Emma handled the logistics with the funeral home while my father selected readings, chose flowers, and invited guests. I learned the details by calling the funeral home directly, pretending to be a family friend seeking information about service, times. When I called my father to discuss my role in the service, perhaps reading one of my mother's favorite poems or sharing a memory, his response was swift and final. "You will not be attending the funeral. Your behavior during your mother's final days was disrespectful and traumatic. I won't have you disrupting her memorial service with more of your dramatics." I spent 10 minutes trying to reason with him, explaining that my mother would have wanted me there, that grief was making him unreasonable, that families should come together during such times rather than fracture further. His voice remained steady and cold throughout my pleas. "You made your choice when you decided your opinions were more important than your mother's care. You chose to create conflict rather than support during her final days. These are the consequences of those choices. The service is for people who honored her memory through their actions, not their intentions." The funeral took place on a gray Saturday morning at St. Mark's Episcopal Church, where my mother had volunteered in the library for 15 years. I sat in my car across the street, watching colleagues from my father's accounting practice, neighbors from their subdivision, and Emma's co-workers from Meridian Capital file into the building where my mother's life was being commemorated, without her elder daughter present. The irony wasn't lost on me that I, who had spent months advocating for my mother's voice to be heard in her medical decisions, was now silenced at the moment when her life was being publicly remembered and celebrated. The exclusion felt like erasure, as if my relationship with her was being declared invalid, my grief deemed unworthy of acknowledgement. After the service ended and the crowd dispersed, I drove to the cemetery where my mother was being laid to rest. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I waited until the formal ceremony concluded and most attendees had departed before approaching the graveside. Emma spotted me first, her face displaying a complex mixture of sadness, embarrassment, and something that might have been relief. "Sarah," she said quietly, glancing toward our father who was accepting condolences from the remaining mourners. "I'm glad you came." "I couldn't not come," I replied, kneeling to place a small bouquet of jasmine flowers, my mother's favorite, near the headstone. "She raised me too. She loved me too. No matter what he says, I belonged here." Emma nodded, tears fresh in her eyes. "I tried to talk to him, I really did. But you know how he gets when he's decided something. He said you had chosen confrontation over family unity, and he wasn't going to reward that behavior." The conversation was interrupted by my father's approach, his face set in the expression of controlled displeasure I had known since childhood. "I told you not to come." "She was my mother too," I said, standing but not stepping away from the grave. "I had every right to say goodbye." "You said goodbye when you chose to argue with her medical team instead of supporting her treatment. You said goodbye when you tried to convince her to give up fighting. You said goodbye when you created chaos during her final days, instead of providing peace. The accusations hung in the afternoon air, witnessed by the few remaining mourners, who had stopped their conversations to observe our confrontation. I felt the familiar pattern of family dynamics attempting to reassert itself, the expectation that I would apologize for my perspective, accommodate his narrative, and accept his version of events to restore harmony. Instead, I found myself responding, with a clarity that surprised us both. I said hello to honesty when everyone else was committed to denial. I said hello to Mom's actual wishes when everyone else was imposing their own fears. And I'm saying hello to my grief, which exists regardless of your approval. I placed my hand briefly on the headstone, whispering a private goodbye to the woman who had quietly supported my independence even when she couldn't defend it publicly. Then I walked away from the cemetery, from my father's anger and from Emma's conflicted loyalty, not knowing that this moment of exclusion was actually the beginning of my inclusion in something far more significant. The days following the funeral passed in a strange, suspended state. I had taken bereavement leave from the Tribune, but without the rituals of mourning that typically structure such periods, I found myself adrift. My father's rejection had severed my connection to the formal grieving process, leaving me to navigate loss in isolation. I spent hours walking through Discovery Park, where my mother and I had hiked together during my teenage years. She had used these walks to ask about my interests, my concerns, and my dreams for the future. Unlike the family dinner conversations, dominated by my father's opinions and expectations, our hiking conversations had been genuine exchanges where my thoughts and feelings were valued rather than corrected. During one particularly difficult afternoon, I found myself at the bench overlooking Puget Sound, where my mother and I had sat during our last walk together, just 2 months before her diagnosis. She had seemed unusually contemplative that day, asking questions about my work that went beyond polite interest into genuine curiosity about investigative techniques and source protection. "Do you ever worry about powerful people trying to silence your reporting?" she had asked, watching. The ferries navigate between the islands. "Sometimes," I had answered honestly. "But that's usually a sign that the story needs to be told. The more resistance I encounter, the more important the truth usually is." She had nodded thoughtfully, then asked a question that had seemed odd at the time. "What would you do if you discovered that people close to you were involved in the kind of corruption you investigate?" I had assumed she was speaking hypothetically, perhaps worried about potential conflicts of interest in my reporting. "I'd have to follow the story wherever it led," I had replied. "Truth doesn't become less true because it's inconvenient or personal." Sitting on that same bench now, 6 days after being banned from her funeral, I found myself wondering if that conversation had been less hypothetical than I had assumed. My mother had been careful with her words, but she had also been deliberate in her questions. Had she been trying to prepare me for something? The thought was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a text from Emma. "Coffee tomorrow? I have something I need to discuss with you. Can you meet me at Grind Coffee on Capitol Hill at 2 p.m.? I agreed, grateful for any connection to family, even one complicated by the tension of recent events. Emma had always occupied a difficult position between my father's expectations and my independence. She had chosen the path of least resistance, pursuing financial security and parental approval, but she had never actively participated in my father's criticism of my choices. Grind Coffee occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in Capitol Hill, popular with freelancers and remote workers for its reliable Wi-Fi and tolerant attitude toward laptop camping. I arrived early, claiming a table near the back where we could talk privately, and ordered the lavender latte my mother had introduced me to during one of our rare sister outings. Emma appeared precisely at 2, her professional attire standing out among the deliberately casual coffee shop clientele. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and the pallor that comes from too many hours under fluorescent office lighting. She ordered black coffee and joined me at the corner table, immediately pulling out her phone and setting it face down between us. I need to tell you something, she began without preamble. But I'm not sure where to start. Before I could respond, a man in an expensive suit approached our table with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention. He was tall, probably in his early 50s, with the kind of aggressively styled hair and aggressive cologne that suggested investment banking or high-end real estate. "Emma," he said warmly, completely ignoring my presence. "I didn't expect to see you here on a Saturday. I thought you were taking personal time this week." Emma's face transformed into the polite professional mask I had seen her wear at family gatherings when my father's business associates joined us for dinner. "Hi, Mr. Davidson. Yes, I'm just having coffee with my sister." Mr. Davidson's gaze shifted to me for the first time, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed my appearance. I was wearing jeans and a sweater, my reporter's uniform for weekend. Casual meetings, nothing that should have triggered particular interest. But something in his expression suggested recognition, though I was certain we had never met. "Your sister," he repeated slowly, his tone shifting to something that might have been surprise or amusement. "And you are?" "Sarah Chen," I replied, extending my hand out of professional habit. "I'm a journalist with the Seattle Tribune." The change in his demeanor was immediate and startling. His polite businessman facade cracked, replaced by something that looked almost like deference. He straightened his posture, shifted his briefcase to his other hand, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a tone of unmistakable respect. "Hi, owner." The two words hung in the air between us like a revelation waiting to be understood. Emma's face went completely white, her coffee cup freezing halfway to her lips. Mr. Davidson seemed to realize he had said something significant, though I couldn't understand what or why. "I'm sorry," I said, confused by the sudden shift in dynamics. "I think you might have me confused with someone else." Mr. Davidson glanced quickly between Emma and me, clearly realizing he had revealed something that wasn't supposed to be revealed. His businessman's composure reasserted itself, but not before I caught a glimpse of genuine concern in his eyes. "Of course," he said quickly. "My mistake. Please excuse the interruption. Emma, I'll see you in the office Monday." He departed with unseemly haste, leaving Emma and me staring at each other across a table that suddenly felt like it contained much more than coffee and confused conversation. The word owner echoed in my mind, completely disconnected from anything I understood about my life, my family, or my relationship to Emma's workplace. "Emma," I said slowly, "what just happened? Why did your boss call me owner? What does that even mean?" My sister's hands were shaking as she set down her coffee cup. The professional mask had completely disappeared, replaced by an expression of panic and something that looked disturbingly like guilt. "Sarah," she said quietly, "that's what I needed to talk to you about. What I've been trying to figure out how to tell you since Mom died. What I've been trying to understand myself for the past 6 months." The coffee shop noise seemed to fade into background static as I focused entirely on my sister's face, trying to read the complex emotions playing across her features. Fear, certainly. Guilt, definitely. But also something else, something that might have been relief at no longer carrying a secret alone. "Tell me what?" I prompted, though part of me sensed that whatever Emma was about to reveal would fundamentally change my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my family, my mother, and my own place in the world. Emma took a deep breath, looking around the coffee shop as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned forward and lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "Mom owned Meridian Capital Management, Sarah, the company where I work, where Mr. Davidson is supposedly the CEO. She owned it completely, secretly, and according to the documents I found after she died, she left it all to you." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, forcing me to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. My mother, Linda Chen, the quiet woman who had spent 30 years supporting my father's accounting practice and deferring to his financial decisions, had secretly owned one of Seattle's most prominent investment firms, the same firm where my sister had been climbing the corporate ladder, believing she was earning her promotions through merit and dedication. "That's impossible," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. "Mom never had that kind of money. Dad handles all the family finances. She didn't even have her own credit card until 5 years ago." Emma's laugh was bitter and hollow. "That's what I thought too. What we were all supposed to think. But I've spent the last 6 months going through documents, Sarah. Mom was brilliant at hiding her wealth. She structured everything through shell companies, offshore accounts, and legal trusts that kept her name completely separate from the business operations." My mind raced through memories, searching for clues I might have missed. My mother's modest lifestyle, her careful budgeting, her deference to my father's opinions about money. Had it all been an elaborate performance? "How long have you known about this?" "I started finding pieces in March, about 6 months before she died." Emma pulled a manila folder from her briefcase, glancing around nervously before sliding it across the table. She had been having me handle some of her personal paperwork, supposedly just organizing files and managing her medical records. But I kept finding documents that didn't make sense. I opened the folder to find copies of corporate filings, bank statements from accounts I'd never heard of, and legal documents bearing my mother's signature alongside entities like Pacific Holdings, LLC, and Chen Investment Trust. The numbers were staggering. Account balances that exceeded my father's entire annual income, stock holdings in companies I recognized from my business reporting, real estate investments across 3 states. "Emma, this shows millions of dollars. How did she accumulate this? Without anyone knowing?" "That's what I've been trying to figure out." Emma leaned closer, her voice dropping even lower. "The earliest documents I can find date back to 1995, 2 years after she married Dad. She started with small investments, maybe money she had saved before marriage, but she was incredibly smart about it. She bought into tech companies before the internet boom, invested in Seattle real estate before the Amazon explosion, made moves that turned thousands into millions. I studied a bank statement showing a balance that exceeded anything I had ever imagined my family possessing. But why hide it? Why live like we were middle class when she had this kind of wealth?" Emma's expression darkened. "Because Dad would have controlled it. Think about how he handles money, Sarah. Every purchase has to be justified, every expense scrutinized. He still makes me account for my spending when I visit, and I'm 26 years old with my own career. Can you imagine what he would have done with access to this kind of money?" The assessment was devastatingly accurate. My father's relationship with money had always been characterized by extreme control and conservative caution. He researched purchases for weeks before committing, maintained detailed spreadsheets tracking every expense, and frequently lectured about the dangers of financial risk-taking. The idea of my mother having independent wealth, much less the kind of wealth that could influence major business decisions, would have been antithetical to everything he believed about proper family financial management. "So she built this entire financial empire in secret," I said slowly, processing the magnitude of what Emma was revealing. "But why did she put you to work at Meridian? Did she know you were her employee?" "That's where it gets complicated." Emma pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of a law firm I didn't recognize. "I don't think she planned for me to work there initially. When I got hired 3 years ago, I thought it was because of my finance degree and internship experience. But look at this." The document was a memo dated 2 weeks after Emma's hiring, discussing the strategic placement of a family member within Meridian's operational structure to provide internal oversight and reporting capabilities. It was signed by Linda Chen, using what appeared to be her legal name as the company's owner. "She hired you specifically to spy on her own company? More like to be her eyes and ears inside the operation. Mom never visited the offices. never. Appeared at board meetings, never interacted directly with the executive team. As far as everyone at Meridian knew, the company was owned by a complex network of investment entities managed by external law firms. She needed someone she trusted to monitor how the business was actually being run. The implications were staggering. My sister had spent 3 years believing she was building an independent career, while actually serving as our mother's covert agent within her own company. "Did you know you were reporting to her?" Not initially. She would ask me casual questions about work during family dinners, and I thought she was just being polite. But gradually her questions became more specific. She wanted to know about particular clients, specific deals, personnel decisions. When I started finding the documents, I realized she had been gathering intelligence about her own business through my reports. I leaned back in my chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of what my mother had constructed. A secret financial empire, managed through intermediaries and shell companies, monitored through her own daughter who believed she was simply sharing workplace stories with an interested parent. "This is incredibly sophisticated, Emma. How did she learn to do all this?" "That's what I've been trying to understand. Mom never went to business school. She worked as a secretary before marrying Dad, and after that she was mostly focused on raising us and supporting his practice. But somehow she developed expertise in corporate finance, investment strategy, and legal structures that most MBA graduates never master." Emma pulled out a leather portfolio I recognized as one my mother had kept in her bedroom desk. "I found this after the funeral. It's filled with business books, investment guides, and legal texts, all heavily annotated." In her handwriting. She had been educating herself for decades, Sarah, learning everything she needed to know to build and protect wealth while maintaining complete secrecy. I flipped through pages of notes written in my mother's careful script, analyzing market trends, evaluating investment opportunities, and developing strategies for asset protection. The depth of knowledge displayed was remarkable, representing years of dedicated study that she had somehow conducted without anyone in our family noticing. "But why leave it to me?" I asked, returning to the question that seemed most important and most confusing. "Emma, you're the one with the finance background. You understand this world. I'm a journalist who can barely manage my own checking account." Emma's smile was sad but genuine. "Because you're the one who can't be controlled. Think about it, Sarah. Dad has spent your entire life trying to make you conform to his expectations, and you've never capitulated. You chose journalism despite his disapproval. You pursued investigative work despite his criticism. You spoke up for Mom's wishes despite his authority. You're the only person in our family who has consistently prioritized truth over convenience." The observation struck me as both accurate and terrifying. My resistance to my father's control had always felt like a character flaw, a stubborn inability to accept reasonable authority and maintain family harmony. But viewed through the lens of my mother's secret empire, that same stubbornness appeared to be exactly the quality needed to protect her legacy. "There's more," Emma continued, producing another document from her seemingly endless folder. "Mom didn't just leave you Meridian Capital. She left you control of the entire investment portfolio, 6 properties including a house in San Juan Islands that I didn't even know existed, and something called the Chen Foundation, which apparently donates to journalism schools and investigative reporting organizations. The Chen Foundation document revealed an organization that had been quietly supporting press freedom initiatives for 15 years, funding scholarships for students pursuing investigative journalism and providing legal support for reporters facing intimidation or censorship. My mother, who had never publicly expressed opinions about my career choice, had been secretly championing the very profession my father consistently criticized. "She was supporting my work without me knowing about it," I said softly, remembering scholarship announcements and legal defense funds I had read about in journalism publications, never imagining they might be connected to my own family. More than that. Look at the recipient list for last year's grants. Emma pointed to a section of the foundation report that made my breath catch. Several of the organizations listed were ones I had worked with during my most challenging investigations, providing legal support when sources faced retaliation, and funding travel expenses when corporate targets tried to suppress my reporting through economic pressure. She was protecting my career from behind the scenes. She was protecting your independence, Emma corrected, just like she protected her own. Mom understood that financial security was the foundation of freedom, especially for women in families where men control decision-making. She built her wealth in secret because she knew Dad would have taken control of it, and she left it to you because she knew you would use it to maintain independence rather than accumulate power. The conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with an incoming call from an unknown number. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something about the timing felt significant. I answered cautiously. Sarah Chen. Ms. Chen, this is Margaret Walsh from Walsh, Patterson & Associates. We represent your mother's estate. I understand you've recently become aware of certain assets that require your immediate attention. Emma's eyes widened as she overheard the lawyer's voice. I put the call on speaker, keeping my voice low to maintain privacy in the crowded coffee shop. I'm just learning about these assets now, I replied carefully. I wasn't aware my mother had any estate requiring legal representation. Your mother was quite specific about the timing of this disclosure, Margaret Walsh continued. She instructed us to contact you 1 week after the funeral, assuming that would allow sufficient time for family tensions to settle while ensuring you received time-sensitive information promptly. What kind of time-sensitive information? Several matters require your attention as the primary beneficiary. First, there are pending business decisions at Meridian Capital that require owner approval. Second, your father has been making inquiries about your mother's estate that suggest he's unaware of the full scope of her assets. And third, there are documents your mother wanted you to review before making decisions about how to proceed. I exchanged glances with Emma, who looked as bewildered as I felt. Can you be more specific about my father's inquiries? He contacted our office yesterday asking about probate procedures for your mother's estate. He seems to believe her assets consist primarily of personal belongings and a small savings account. He expressed surprise that she had retained legal representation at all. The revelation that my father was actively investigating my mother's estate, while remaining ignorant of its true scope, added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Had my mother anticipated his curiosity? Was this part of her strategic planning or an unforeseen complication? Ms. Walsh, I think I need to meet with you in person to understand what I'm dealing with. Of course, your mother anticipated that request as well. She left detailed instructions for our initial meeting, including documents and explanations she wanted you to review. Are you available tomorrow morning at 10? I confirmed the appointment, noting down the address of a law firm in downtown Seattle that I had passed countless times without ever imagining it housed the legal infrastructure of my mother's secret financial empire. After ending the call, Emma and I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the rapid expansion of what had begun as a simple coffee meeting. This is really happening, Emma said finally. Mom really did all this, and now you're inheriting it all. I don't know anything about running an investment firm, I admitted, feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility that was apparently falling to me. I don't understand corporate finance or business management. How am I supposed to make decisions about other people's money? Maybe that's exactly why she chose you, Emma suggested. You're not going to make decisions based on profit maximization or ego gratification. You're going to make decisions based on what you think is right, which might be exactly what the business needs. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed again, this time with a text from my father. Need to speak with you about your mother's affairs. Can you come to the house tonight? The timing was too coincidental to be accidental. Less than an hour after my conversation with Margaret Walsh, my father was requesting a meeting about the same subject. Either he had learned something about my mother's estate that prompted his urgency, or his inquiries with the law firm had revealed information that demanded immediate family discussion. Emma, did you tell Dad anything about what you found in Mom's documents? No, I've been terrified to say anything. I wasn't sure if I was understanding the documents correctly, and I knew he'd want to take control of the situation immediately. I thought I should talk to you first. But he might have found documents of his own while settling her affairs, I reasoned. Maybe he's discovered some piece of this puzzle that's making him ask questions. Emma looked worried. Sarah, if Dad finds out about Meridian and the other assets, he's going to assume they should pass to him as the surviving spouse. He's not going to accept that Mom specifically left everything to you, especially given how angry he is about the funeral situation. The observation was astute and troubling. My father's worldview included very clear expectations about financial authority within families. The idea that my mother had not only accumulated significant wealth without his knowledge, but had chosen to leave it to the daughter he considered irresponsible rather than to him or to Emma, would challenge everything he believed about proper family dynamics and financial stewardship. I need to think about this strategically, I said, my journalist training finally engaging with the situation. Before I meet with him tonight, I need to understand exactly what I'm inheriting and what legal protections my mother put in place. I can't walk into that conversation blind. What are you going to tell him? As little as possible until I understand the full situation. If Mom went to this much trouble to keep these assets secret from him, she probably had good reasons that I need to understand before making decisions about disclosure. Emma nodded, though she looked troubled by the prospect of continued secrecy. This is going to get complicated quickly, Sarah. Dad isn't going to accept being excluded from decisions about Mom's estate, especially if he discovers there are significant assets involved. Then, I need to be prepared for that confrontation, I replied, feeling a familiar determination that had carried me through challenging investigations. But first, I need to understand what Mom built and why she built it the way she did. We spent another hour reviewing documents Emma had brought, trying to piece together the timeline of my mother's financial activities and the structure of the entities she had created. What emerged was a picture of remarkable foresight and planning. Linda Chen had not just accumulated wealth randomly. She had systematically built an infrastructure designed to survive scrutiny, protect assets from potential claims, and provide ongoing support for causes she valued. She knew this day would come, Emma observed as we reviewed a document outlining succession planning for the Chen Foundation. She prepared for every contingency I can think of, including the possibility that you might not want to accept the inheritance. There's a provision for me to refuse it? Emma pointed to a clause buried in the Foundation's charter. If you decline to accept control of the assets within 90 days of notification, everything transfers to the Investigative Journalism Defense Fund, with a smaller allocation going to me for my cooperation in maintaining the secrecy until you could make an informed decision. The escape clause was both comforting and troubling. My mother had recognized that inheriting her secret empire might not align with my values or goals, but she had also structured the alternative in a way that would honor her commitment to press freedom while ensuring Emma's loyalty during the transition period. What do you think I should do? I asked my sister, genuinely seeking her perspective despite the complexity of her own position in the situation. Emma considered the question seriously before responding. I think you should learn everything you can about what Mom built before making any decisions. Meet with the lawyers, review the business operations, understand the scope of what you're inheriting. But Sarah, I also think you should be prepared for the possibility that this inheritance comes with responsibilities and conflicts you might not be able to walk away from. What do you mean? If Mom left these assets to you instead of Dad, she probably had concerns about how he would use them. And if she spent 15 years hiding this wealth from him, She probably had reasons that go beyond simple financial independence. This might not just be about money, Sarah. This might be about preventing something she thought would be harmful. The implication hung between us as we prepared to leave the coffee shop. My mother's elaborate secrecy hadn't just protected her wealth, it had protected it from my father specifically. Whatever her reasons, she had deemed it necessary to ensure that David Chen never gained access to or control over the financial empire she had built. As Emma gathered her documents and I prepared for the evening confrontation with my father, I found myself thinking about the conversation my mother and I had shared on that bench overlooking Puget Sound. Her questions about investigating corruption, involving people close to me, about following stories wherever they led regardless of personal consequences, suddenly seemed less hypothetical and more like preparation for exactly the situation I was now facing. "Emma," I said as we walked toward our cars, "if you had to guess, what do you think Mom was protecting these assets from? What was she afraid Dad would do if he had access to this kind of money?" Emma stopped walking and turned to face me directly. "I've been wondering the same thing. But Sarah, I think the better question might be, what was she afraid he had already done that made this level of secrecy necessary?" The question followed me as I drove home to prepare for the evening meeting with my father. Whatever I learned from the lawyers tomorrow would help me understand the scope of my inheritance, but the conversation tonight would reveal how much my father already knew and what his intentions were regarding my mother's estate. What I couldn't anticipate was that the evening would bring revelations that would fundamentally change my understanding not just of my mother's wealth, but of my father's financial practices and the true reasons behind the elaborate secrecy that had protected my inheritance until this moment. The Chen family home sat in a planned development in Bellevue, a 3-bedroom craftsman-style house that my father had purchased 15 years earlier when his accounting practice had stabilized, enough to support a mortgage. The neighborhood embodied middle-class respectability, with carefully maintained lawns, 2-car garages, and the kind of architectural uniformity that suggested successful but modest financial circumstances. I arrived at 7:30, parking. In the driveway beside my father's 10-year-old Honda Civic, a vehicle he had chosen for its reliability and fuel efficiency, rather than any aesthetic considerations. The house itself showed similar priorities: well-maintained but not luxurious, functional but not impressive, the kind of property that conveyed financial stability without ostentation. My father met me at the door with the formal politeness he had employed since our argument at the hospital. "Sarah, thank you for coming. I've made tea." The living room where we settled was exactly as my mother had left it, filled with the books she loved and the plants she had tended with devoted attention. My father had made no changes since her death, leaving her reading glasses on the side table beside her favorite chair, her bookmark still holding her place in a novel she would never finish. "I've been going through your mother's papers," he began without preamble, settling into his own chair with a manila folder that looked suspiciously similar to the one Emma had brought to the coffee shop. "There are some financial matters that don't make sense to me." I maintained neutral expression while my heart rate accelerated. "What kind of financial matters?" He opened the folder and produced a bank statement I hadn't seen before. This one showing a modest savings account with my mother's name and a balance of approximately $12,000. "This appears to be your mother's personal account, separate from our joint household accounts." I wasn't aware she had been maintaining independent savings. The amount was significant enough to attract attention, but small enough to seem like careful budgeting rather than systematic wealth accumulation. I suspected this account was exactly what my mother had intended my father to find: a deliberately visible asset that would satisfy his need to investigate while concealing the existence of much larger holdings. Maybe she wanted to have some independence, I suggested carefully. A lot of women maintain personal accounts for emergencies or gifts. His expression tightened slightly. "Your mother and I discussed all financial decisions together. We agreed that maintaining separate accounts created unnecessary complications and reduced our ability to optimize our household budget. This account, represents a departure from our established financial practices. I recognized the language my father used when discussing money: optimization, efficiency, established practices. For him, financial management was a technical discipline requiring systematic control and careful coordination. The idea that my mother might have valued financial independence over household optimization would indeed seem like a fundamental departure from their agreed-upon approach. Did you ask her about the account while she was alive? I discovered it only this week while organizing her documents for probate. He produced another paper. This one, a letter from a bank I didn't recognize. But there's more. This letter references account services for which I can find no corresponding documentation. It mentions investment advisory services and trust management, services your mother never discussed with me. The letter was carefully worded, describing portfolio adjustments and asset allocation modifications, in language that could refer to complex investment strategies or simple savings account management. Without additional context, it would be impossible to determine the scope of the financial services being referenced. Maybe she was planning for retirement, I offered. She might have wanted to surprise you with additional savings she had accumulated for your future together. The suggestion seemed to resonate with my father's preference for logical explanations. That's possible. Your mother was always concerned about our retirement security, though I assured her repeatedly that my practice and our current savings would provide adequate support. He paused, studying the bank letter more carefully. But this letter is dated only 3 months ago, well after her diagnosis. Why would she have been making investment adjustments when she knew her medical expenses would require immediate liquidity? The question demonstrated the analytical thinking that had made my father successful as an accountant, but it also revealed his assumption that all financial decisions should be optimized for immediate practical concerns. The possibility that my mother might have been making arrangements for long-term goals that extended beyond her own lifetime wouldn't naturally occur to someone who approached money as a resource to be efficiently managed rather than a tool for complex legacy planning. Dad, did you find anything else unusual in her papers? He hesitated before producing another document, this one bearing the letterhead of the law firm I was scheduled to visit tomorrow. She apparently retained legal representation for estate planning purposes. The attorney's letter mentions complex asset structures that require specialized probate procedures. My breath caught as I recognized Margaret Walsh's law firm letterhead. The letter my father had received was clearly designed to prompt exactly this conversation, providing enough information to justify legal consultation while revealing nothing specific about the assets in question. Complex asset structures, I repeated, trying to sound puzzled rather than informed. What does that mean? I'm not certain, but it suggests your mother's estate may be more complicated than I anticipated. My father's frustration was evident as he struggled with financial complexity that extended beyond his familiar domain of household budgeting and small business accounting. I've scheduled an appointment with the attorney for Monday morning to clarify the situation. Monday morning, the same day I was scheduled to meet with Margaret Walsh, though presumably at a different time. My mother's planning had once again anticipated potential conflicts, arranging for both my father and me to receive information, while ensuring we wouldn't encounter each other at the law office. I think that's wise, I said carefully. If Mom had complex financial arrangements, it's important to understand them properly before making decisions. That's why I wanted to speak with you tonight. My father leaned forward, adopting the serious tone he used when discussing important family matters. Despite our recent disagreements, you are still my daughter and your mother's heir. Whatever assets she left, they will need to be managed responsibly and in accordance with her wishes. The phrase, your mother's heir, carried significant weight in my father's worldview. As the surviving spouse, he would naturally expect to inherit my mother's property, but his use of the term heir suggested he was prepared to acknowledge my legitimate claim to whatever she had left, even if he intended to maintain supervisory authority over how that inheritance was managed. "What are you thinking about management?" I asked, genuinely curious about his expectations. "Your mother was careful with money, but she wasn't sophisticated about investment strategies or complex financial planning. Whatever arrangements she made, they'll need professional oversight to ensure they serve her intended purposes effectively." He paused, clearly preparing to make an important point. "Your journalism background doesn't include training in financial management, Sarah. I think you'll need guidance to handle these responsibilities appropriately." The offer was exactly what I had expected, couched in reasonable terms that disguised an assumption of continued paternal authority over my financial decisions. In my father's perspective, my mother's wealth, regardless of its extent, represented a family resource that required his expertise to manage properly. "What kind of guidance are you thinking about?" "I could oversee the investment management and ensure the assets are preserved and grown responsibly. You could maintain ultimate ownership while benefiting from my experience with financial planning and tax optimization." His tone suggested he considered this a generous offer that would relieve me of unwelcome complexity while ensuring professional stewardship of my inheritance. "That's thoughtful of you to offer," I replied carefully. "But I think I should understand what I'm inheriting before making decisions about management structure." His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. But Sarah, you should also consider the potential consequences of mismanaging inherited assets. Complex financial structures require expertise to maintain properly. Amateur decision-making can result in significant losses or legal complications." The warning carried an undertone of threat, disguised as fatherly concern. My father was signaling that my independence in managing the inheritance could result in financial disaster, while his oversight would provide security and professional competence. It was the same dynamic that had characterized our relationship throughout my adult life. His expertise offered as protection from the consequences of my poor judgment. "I understand the importance of professional management," I assured him. "I just want to understand what Mom intended before making commitments about how to proceed. Your mother's intentions, while well-meaning, may not have accounted for the practical realities of asset management." My father's tone suggested he was losing patience with my reluctance to accept his guidance immediately. She was generous and caring, but she wasn't financially sophisticated. Her arrangements may require modification to achieve her actual goals. The characterization of my mother as financially naive stung, particularly given what I had learned about her secret empire that afternoon. But it also revealed my father's fundamental assumption that complex financial planning was beyond my mother's capabilities, making him the natural authority for interpreting and improving whatever arrangements she had made. "Dad, do you think Mom might have had reasons for keeping financial information private? Maybe she wanted to surprise you? Or maybe she was planning something special that required secrecy?" He considered the question seriously. "Your mother valued family harmony above individual recognition. If she made financial arrangements without discussing them with me, it was probably because she wanted to avoid potential disagreements about strategy or timing. She preferred to present completed plans rather than debate options during development." The explanation demonstrated my father's ability to interpret my mother's behavior in ways that confirmed his existing beliefs about proper family dynamics. In his framework, my mother's secrecy was evidence of her desire to avoid conflict, not her need to maintain independence or protect assets from his control. But once you understand her arrangements, you'll want to optimize them, right? Naturally, whatever your mother intended, we can honor her goals while ensuring the assets are managed with appropriate sophistication and oversight. He leaned back in his chair, clearly believing he had addressed my concerns reasonably. The important thing is that we work together as a family to preserve her legacy appropriately. The conversation continued for another hour, with my father, outlining his vision for collaborative management of my mother's estate, while I provided non-committal responses that avoided either accepting or rejecting his proposals. What became increasingly clear was that his framework for understanding the situation didn't include the possibility that my mother had specifically excluded him from control of her assets, or that she might have had concerns about his financial judgment that warranted such exclusion. As I prepared to leave, my father made one final observation that revealed the extent of his assumptions about the situation. "Sarah, I hope you understand that managing inherited wealth is a significant responsibility that affects not just your own financial security, but the family's long-term stability. Your mother trusted us to preserve what she built, and that means making decisions based on practical wisdom rather than emotional reactions." The statement positioned him as my mother's partner in wealth preservation while casting any resistance to his guidance as emotional rather than rational. It was a masterful example of the rhetorical strategies he had used throughout my childhood to establish his authority as the family's financial decision-maker and protector of long-term interests. "I understand the responsibility," I replied. "I just want to make sure I honor her specific wishes rather than imposing my own assumptions about what she would have wanted." "Of course," he agreed, though his tone suggested he considered my distinction between honoring her wishes and accepting his interpretation of them to be unnecessary refinement rather than meaningful difference. As I drove away from my childhood home, I found myself thinking about the complex performance my mother had maintained for 3 decades. Her financial naivety, her deference to my father's expertise, her apparent satisfaction with modest middle-class lifestyle had all been carefully constructed to conceal an entirely different reality. She had allowed my father to believe he was the family's financial authority, while secretly building an empire that dwarfed anything he had ever managed. But more troubling was the possibility that her secrecy hadn't just been about independence, but about protection. If my mother had been hiding assets from my father for 3 decades, what had she observed about his character or judgment that made such concealment necessary? And what would happen when he discovered that his assumptions about her financial sophistication and his own authority over her estate were completely incorrect? The next morning would bring answers to some of these questions, but it would also bring new complications as I began to understand the true scope of what my mother had built and the reasons she had been so determined to keep it hidden from the man who believed he had been her partner in all financial decisions. The revelation of my mother's secret empire was only the beginning of a much larger truth about our family's finances, my father's business practices, and the careful strategies my mother had developed to protect not just her wealth, but something far more valuable, evidence that would change everything I thought I knew about the man who had raised me. Margaret Walsh's law office occupied the 20th floor of Columbia Center, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. The space exuded understated elegance, with rich mahogany furnishings, and legal texts that suggested decades of sophisticated estate planning experience. When I arrived for my 10 o'clock appointment, I was immediately escorted to a private conference room where Margaret Walsh waited with 3 additional attorneys and a stack of documents that appeared to chronicle my mother's entire financial life. "Ms. Chen," Margaret said, rising to greet me with the composed professionalism of someone who had guided countless families through complex inheritance transitions. "Thank you for coming. Your mother spoke of you often during our planning sessions. She was very proud of your journalism work, particularly your investigation of the construction company that was illegally dumping toxic waste." The reference to my specific reporting caught me off guard. My mother had never mentioned following my work in such detail, yet this attorney was discussing my investigative projects as if they had been regular topics of conversation during their meetings. "How often did you meet with my mother?" I asked, settling into the leather chair across from the legal team. "Monthly for the past 5 years, weekly during the final 6 months of her life." Margaret opened the first folder in her stack, revealing documents that bore my mother's signature alongside dates spanning nearly 2 decades. Linda Chen was one of our most meticulous clients. She approached estate planning with the same systematic attention she applied to building her investment portfolio. One of the associate attorneys, a woman in her 30s who introduced herself as Rebecca Norton, leaned forward with a tablet displaying what appeared to be an organizational chart. Before we discuss specific assets, we need to help you understand the structure your mother created. She didn't just accumulate wealth randomly. She built an integrated system designed to achieve multiple objectives while maintaining complete secrecy from certain parties. The chart revealed a complex network of limited liability companies, trusts, and holding entities, all connected by lines that showed how money flowed between different components of my mother's financial architecture. At the center sat something called the Chen Family Trust, with branches extending to entities I recognized from Emma's documents and others I had never heard of. The primary objective was asset protection, Margaret explained, tracing the connections with her finger. Your mother was concerned about potential claims against her wealth from parties who might feel entitled to control or benefit from her financial success. She structured everything to ensure legal separation between her assets and any claims that might arise through family relationships or business associations. Claims from my father, I said, recognizing the careful legal language that avoided direct accusations while making the situation clear. Among others, Rebecca Norton replied diplomatically, your mother was also concerned about potential business liabilities that might affect her holdings if certain financial practices were ever investigated or challenged. She wanted to ensure her wealth remained protected, regardless of what legal complications might arise in related areas. The phrase, certain financial practices, sent a chill through me as I remembered Emma's question about what our mother might have been protecting her assets from, and her suggestion that the better question was what she was afraid our father had already done that made such secrecy necessary. Are you saying my father's accounting practice is involved in questionable activities? Margaret Walsh exchanged glances with her colleagues before responding carefully. We're saying your mother had concerns about potential legal vulnerabilities that extended beyond her own business activities. She wanted to ensure complete separation between her assets and any claims that might arise from related financial matters. The third attorney, an older man who had been quietly reviewing documents, looked up with an expression of concern. Ms. Chen, your mother left explicit instructions about how much information to share with you initially. She wanted you to understand the scope of your inheritance first, then decide how much additional detail you wanted about her specific concerns that motivated this level of protection. I want to know everything, I said without hesitation, my investigative instincts fully engaged. If my mother went to this much trouble to protect these assets, I need to understand what she was protecting them from. Margaret nodded as if she had expected this response. Very well. Your mother discovered irregularities in your father's business practices approximately 6 years ago. She found evidence that he was manipulating financial records for several of his clients to minimize their tax obligations in ways that crossed legal boundaries into fraud territory. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My father, whose entire professional identity was built on careful attention to financial regulations and ethical business practices, was apparently involved in systematic tax fraud that had motivated my mother to spend years protecting her wealth from potential legal claims. What kind of irregularities? Rebecca Norton pulled up another document on her tablet, this one showing spreadsheets with highlighted sections that revealed patterns of suspicious reporting. Your mother had access to your father's business files through their joint office computer. She began reviewing his work after noticing discrepancies in your family's own tax returns that didn't align with the financial information she had provided him. The spreadsheets showed client accounts where income had been systematically underreported, deductions had been inflated beyond reasonable limits, and business expenses had been fabricated to reduce tax obligations. The pattern was clear and extensive. affecting dozens of clients over multiple years and representing hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid taxes. She started investigating him, I said, recognizing the systematic approach that characterized my mother's investment strategies applied to uncovering my father's fraudulent activities. She documented everything, Margaret confirmed, producing a leather portfolio filled with printed emails, financial records, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs of my father meeting with clients at locations that seemed designed to avoid creating official records of their conversations. Your mother was very thorough, Rebecca added. She understood that if your father's activities were ever discovered by tax authorities, any assets connected to him could be subject to seizure as proceeds of criminal activity. She needed to establish complete legal separation between her wealth and his business practices. I studied the surveillance photographs, which showed my father in coffee shops and parking lots, apparently conducting business meetings in locations where formal records wouldn't be created. The level of secrecy suggested he understood the illegal nature of his activities and was deliberately avoiding documentation that could be used as evidence against him. How extensive is this fraud? The older attorney, who introduced himself as Robert Kim, opened another folder containing what appeared to be financial analyses of my father's entire client base. Based on your mother's investigation, we estimate your father has facilitated tax avoidance schemes that have deprived federal and state governments of approximately $2 million over the past 8 years. The number was staggering, representing systematic criminal activity on a scale that would certainly result in federal prosecution if discovered. My father wasn't making occasional errors or pushing boundaries of aggressive tax planning. He was operating a sophisticated fraud scheme that had enriched his clients while exposing him to serious criminal liability. Why didn't she report him to authorities? Margaret's expression grew troubled. She considered it, but she was concerned. About the impact on your family, your father's prosecution would have destroyed his business, eliminated his income, and likely resulted in substantial financial penalties that could have affected family assets, even despite her protective structures. She also worried about the emotional impact on you and Emma. So she chose to protect her wealth while allowing him to continue defrauding the government. She chose to document everything while building financial independence that would protect her family's security, regardless of what legal consequences your father might eventually face, Rebecca corrected diplomatically. Your mother understood that his activities would likely be discovered eventually, either through routine audits or through client testimony if any of his fraud participants were investigated for other reasons. The portfolio of evidence was comprehensive and damning, but it also revealed the impossible position my mother had occupied for years. Reporting my father's crimes would have destroyed our family's financial stability and emotional relationships, but remaining silent made her complicit in ongoing criminal activity that violated her own ethical standards. She left all this evidence to me, I said, recognizing the burden she had transferred along with the wealth. She left you choices, Margaret replied carefully. Your inheritance includes complete financial independence regardless of what happens to your father's business or legal situation. But it also includes evidence that you can use to protect yourself and others if his activities are discovered, or to report his crimes if you decide that's the appropriate course of action. The weight of those choices settled over me as I reviewed more documents that detailed not just my father's fraudulent activities, but their impact on legitimate taxpayers who were bearing the burden of revenue lost to his schemes. My mother had protected me financially while leaving me to wrestle with the moral and legal implications of my father's crimes. There's more, Robert Kim said, producing yet another folder. Your mother discovered that your father has been recommending his fraudulent tax strategies to other accounting professionals, essentially franchising his criminal methods to expand their impact beyond his own client base. The expansion of my father's fraud into what amounted to a criminal network multiplied both the scope of his illegal activities and the potential legal consequences he faced. He wasn't just cheating on individual tax returns, he was corrupting other professionals and systematically undermining tax collection across a broader network of businesses and individuals. How many other accountants are involved? Your mother identified at least 12 professionals who appear to be implementing similar strategies after consulting with your father. The total tax revenue lost through this expanded network likely exceeds $5 million annually. The revelation transformed my understanding of my father from an individual criminal to the leader of a fraud network that was stealing millions from public resources that funded schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. His activities weren't victimless tax avoidance. They were systematic theft from the community resources that supported vulnerable populations. She wanted me to have options, I said, beginning to understand the complexity of what my mother had bequeathed me. Financial independence if I choose to remain silent, or comprehensive evidence if I decide to pursue justice. Exactly, Margaret confirmed. But she also wanted you to understand that your father's activities are escalating. His recent attempts to access her estate suggest he may be facing increased financial pressure, possibly because his fraud network is becoming more expensive to maintain or because he's concerned about potential exposure. The observation aligned with my father's unusual urgency about settling my mother's estate and his assumptions about gaining control over whatever assets she had left. If his criminal activities were creating financial stress or legal vulnerability, he might desperately need access to legitimate funds that could provide security or pay for legal defense. What happens to Meridian Capital if I decide to report his crimes? Rebecca pulled up a detailed analysis of how criminal prosecution of my father might affect the various entities my mother had created. Your mother structured everything to ensure complete legal separation. Your father has no ownership stake in any of your inherited entities, and none of your wealth can be claimed as proceeds of his criminal activities. Your assets remain protected regardless of what legal consequences he faces. Us? The protection was complete and sophisticated, reflecting years of careful planning by a woman who understood both the scope of her husband's crimes and the necessity of shielding her family from their consequences. She had built not just financial independence, but legal independence that would allow me to make decisions based on my own ethical standards rather than fear of personal consequences. She left me free to do the right thing, I said softly, recognizing the gift of moral clarity that my mother had provided along with financial security. She left you free to be yourself, Margaret corrected. Your mother often said that your commitment to truth-telling, even when it created personal difficulties, was your most valuable characteristic. She wanted to ensure you could apply that commitment to this situation without fear of destroying your own security or your sister's future. The conversation continued for 2 more hours as the legal team walked me through the specific mechanisms my mother had created to protect and transfer her wealth. The Chen Foundation would continue its support of investigative journalism while providing me with ongoing income that would ensure financial independence regardless of my career choices. Meridian Capital would operate under professional management unless I chose to become actively involved in its operations. The various properties and investment accounts would generate substantial passive income while appreciating in value under careful stewardship. But the most significant inheritance was the evidence portfolio that documented my father's crimes in detail, sufficient to support federal prosecution. My mother had spent years methodically building a case that could destroy the man who had shared her life for 3 decades, while simultaneously building wealth that would protect their children from the consequences of his destruction. As I prepared to leave the law office, Margaret Walsh provided one final observation that crystallized the complexity of my situation. Your mother loved your father despite his crimes, but she loved justice more. She couldn't bring herself to destroy him, but she ensured that someone who shared her values would eventually have that choice. The weight of that choice followed me as I descended 20 floors to street level and walked toward the waterfront, where I could think clearly about the path forward. My mother had given me everything I needed to live independently and pursue justice. but she had also given me the burden of deciding whether to use that power to destroy my father and expose his criminal network. The afternoon sun reflected off Elliott Bay as I sat on a bench near the ferry terminal, reviewing the documents that detailed my father's fraud network and considering the implications of the choices before me. I could maintain my mother's silence, preserving family relationships while allowing criminal activity to continue, or I could honor her commitment to justice by reporting crimes that would likely result in my father's imprisonment and the destruction of any possibility for family reconciliation. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Dad called. He's very upset about his meeting with the estate lawyers. He wants to meet with both of us tonight to discuss what he calls disturbing revelations about Mom's financial arrangements. I think you need to be prepared for a confrontation." The message confirmed what I had expected. My father's meeting with Margaret Walsh had revealed enough about my mother's estate to challenge his assumptions about his authority over her assets, though he likely still didn't understand the full scope of what she had hidden from him or the reasons for her secrecy. But now I understood both the wealth I had inherited and the evidence that could destroy him. The confrontation Emma was anticipating would determine not just how our family navigated the transition of my mother's assets, but whether I would use the power she had given me to expose his crimes and protect the community from his ongoing fraud. As I walked back toward my car, I made the decision that would define not just my relationship with my father, but my commitment to the principles my mother had spent her life protecting. The woman who had been banned from her own mother's funeral was about to become the person who would either preserve family harmony or pursue justice, but not both. The Chen family home felt different when I arrived that evening, charged with tension that went beyond normal family disagreements. Emma's car was already in the driveway, and through the living room windows I could see her and my father engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. The scene reminded me of the family meetings we had held during my teenage years when my father needed to address what he considered my problematic behavior or poor decision-making. But this time, I was walking into the confrontation armed with complete knowledge of our family's financial reality and evidence of criminal activity that could destroy the man who believed he was about to assert his authority over my mother's estate. The power dynamic that had characterized our relationship for 28 years was about to shift dramatically, though my father had no idea how completely his assumptions about family hierarchy were about to be challenged. Emma met me at the door with an expression of barely controlled anxiety. "He knows about Meridian," she whispered urgently. "The lawyers told him Mom owned it. He's been asking me questions about my job that I can't answer, without revealing how much I knew about the situation." "What did you tell him?" "That I was as surprised as he was, which is technically true. But Sarah, he's furious. He thinks Mom betrayed him by hiding such significant assets, and he's convinced the lawyers are trying to manipulate the estate to exclude him from control." My father appeared in the doorway before I could respond, his expression displaying the controlled anger I had learned to recognize as a prelude to lectures about responsibility, respect, and the consequences of poor judgment. But tonight, his anger was directed at my mother's memory rather than my behavior, a shift that revealed how fundamentally the estate revelations had disturbed his understanding of his marriage and his role as family patriarch. "Sarah, I'm glad you're here. We need to discuss the serious problems your mother's lawyers have created with their unnecessarily complex estate arrangements." I followed him into the living room, where Emma had arranged herself in the chair, farthest from the couch, clearly trying to avoid being positioned between us during what she anticipated would be a difficult conversation. My father settled into his usual chair with a legal pad covered in notes, apparently having prepared for this meeting with the systematic approach he applied to challenging financial problems. "The lawyers informed me that your mother secretly owned Meridian Capital Management, where Emma works," he began without preamble. "They also revealed that she accumulated substantial additional assets through investments she never discussed with me, despite our agreement to coordinate all major financial decisions." His tone carried the wounded authority of a man whose fundamental assumptions about family hierarchy had been challenged by evidence he couldn't dispute. The revelation that my mother had operated independently in the financial sphere he considered his domain represented more than secret-keeping. It represented a rejection of his expertise and authority that had characterized their marriage for 3 decades. "I'm sure she had her reasons for privacy," I replied carefully, not yet ready to reveal how much I understood about those reasons. "Privacy," he repeated with bitter emphasis. "That's an interesting way to characterize systematic deception about assets worth millions of dollars. Your mother allowed me to worry about retirement security while she was secretly accumulating enough wealth to fund multiple lifetimes." Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly struggling with her knowledge of our mother's motivations for secrecy. Her position as an unwitting employee of our mother's company had given her insights into the sophisticated financial planning that had motivated such elaborate concealment, but she couldn't share those insights without revealing her own complicity in maintaining our mother's secrets. "Maybe she wanted to surprise you," Emma suggested weakly. "Maybe she was planning to reveal everything when the investments had grown enough to ensure permanent financial security." My father's expression suggested he found this explanation inadequate. "Your mother knew I was concerned about our retirement planning. She participated in conversations about reducing expenses and optimizing our savings while concealing assets that had already solved the problems we were discussing." "That's not surprise planning, Emma. That's deception." The accusation hung in the air as I considered how to respond. My father's anger was understandable from his perspective, but it was based on incomplete information about my mother's motivations. He saw her secrecy as betrayal of their financial partnership, not as protection from the legal vulnerabilities created by his own criminal activities. "Dad, did the lawyers explain why Mom might have felt the need for such privacy?" They made vague references to asset protection strategies and separation of financial risk, but they refused to provide specific details about what risks she was supposedly protecting against. His frustration was evident as he consulted his notes. When I pressed them for clarification, they said those details could only be shared with the primary beneficiary. The phrase primary beneficiary carried particular weight in my father's worldview. As the surviving spouse, he naturally expected to be the primary beneficiary of my mother's estate, regardless of what formal documents might specify. The lawyer's refusal to share information with him represented not just legal technicality, but fundamental challenge to his assumptions about his role in family financial matters. "Who is the primary beneficiary?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would force the confrontation I had been trying to avoid. My father's expression darkened as he delivered information that clearly disturbed him deeply. "According to the estate documents, you are. Your mother left the vast majority of her assets directly to you, with smaller allocations for Emma and charitable donations. I inherit only the house and her personal belongings." The news affected Emma and me differently. Emma looked genuinely surprised, apparently not having understood that the family business she worked for was now entirely mine. But I felt the weight of responsibility my mother had placed on me, not just for managing wealth, but for deciding how to address the criminal activities that had motivated her elaborate secrecy. "I don't understand why she would exclude you from control of assets she accumulated during your marriage," I said honestly, giving my father an opportunity to consider whether his own actions might have motivated her decisions. "Neither do I," he replied, his anger giving way to genuine confusion. "We shared financial goals and values throughout our marriage. I provided the professional expertise that enabled her to make informed investment decisions. Her success was built on the foundation of stability my income provided. It makes no sense for her to exclude me from benefiting from wealth we built together." The characterization of my mother's wealth as something we built together revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of both her financial sophistication and her reasons for concealment. In his framework, her investment success was naturally attributable to his guidance and support, making her decision to exclude him from control an inexplicable rejection of their partnership rather than a rational response to his criminal activities. Maybe she had concerns about something, Emma suggested carefully. Maybe there were problems she knew about that you didn't. My father's attention focused on Emma with sharp intensity. What kind of problems? Did your mother share concerns with you that she didn't discuss with me? Emma glanced at me desperately, clearly struggling with how much truth to reveal. She knew about our mother's documentation of his fraud, but she also understood that exposing his crimes would have devastating consequences for everyone in the room. I just mean that maybe she discovered something that worried her about financial security or legal issues, Emma said carefully. Something that made her think protective measures were necessary. Legal issues, my father repeated slowly. Emma, are you suggesting your mother had reason to believe I was involved in questionable business practices? The direct question forced the moment of truth I had been hoping to avoid until I was better prepared. But my father's analytical mind was working through the puzzle of my mother's secrecy, and he was arriving at conclusions that demanded immediate response. Dad, I said quietly, what would you say if she had discovered evidence of systematic fraud in your accounting practice? The question struck him like a physical blow, his face going pale as he processed the implications of what I had just suggested. The careful notes on his legal pad seemed suddenly irrelevant as he recognized that his wife's elaborate financial secrecy might have been motivated by knowledge of his criminal activities. That's a serious accusation, Sarah, he said slowly. What evidence are you referring to? I pulled out the portfolio Margaret Walsh had given me, placing it on the coffee table between us where all three family members could see the documentation of his fraud network. Mom spent years investigating your business practices. She found evidence of systematic tax fraud affecting dozens of clients and involving other accounting professionals you've been training in illegal methods. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stared at the documents with growing horror as she understood why our mother had been so determined to protect her assets from legal claims. My father studied the evidence of his own crimes with the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed life collapse around him. She was spying on me, he said finally, his voice hollow with the realization that his wife had spent years secretly documenting his criminal activities while maintaining the pretense of loving partnership. She was protecting us, I corrected. She built financial independence that would survive your prosecution. She created legal separation that would keep your crimes from destroying your children's security. And she left me the choice of what to do with evidence that could put you in prison for decades. The power dynamic in the room had completely reversed. My father, who had entered the evening expecting to assert authority over my mother's estate and guide my financial decisions, was now facing the possibility that his daughter held evidence that could destroy his freedom, his reputation, and his life. What do you want? He asked quietly, recognizing that I now controlled the situation completely. I want you to stop, I replied. I want you to end the fraud immediately, cease training other accountants in illegal methods, and cooperate with efforts to ensure your clients pay their legitimate tax obligations. Do that, and I'll consider whether Mom's evidence needs to be shared with federal investigators. Emma looked between us with dawning understanding of the choice I was offering. Our father. I could destroy him using our mother's evidence, or I could use that evidence to force him to end his criminal activities and attempt to make restitution for the damage he had caused. And if I refuse? Then I'll honor Mom's commitment to justice by ensuring that authorities have everything they need to prosecute not just you, but your entire fraud network. I'll use the financial independence she gave me to protect myself and Emma from the consequences, but I won't protect you from accountability for stealing millions from public resources. My father sat in silence for several minutes, reviewing the evidence of his crimes and considering the choice I had offered him. When he finally spoke, His voice carried the defeated recognition of a man who understood that his authority over his family had been permanently transferred to the daughter he had tried so hard to control. "I'll need time to wind down the practices you've documented and to coordinate with the other professionals involved. Some of the arrangements are complex and involve ongoing client relationships that can't be changed immediately." "You have 90 days, I said, invoking the time frame my mother had established for my own decisions about the inheritance. "After that, any continuing evidence of fraud goes to federal investigators, regardless of complications or consequences." The evening ended with my father agreeing to my terms and Emma promising to help monitor his compliance while maintaining her position at Meridian Capital, which she now understood was entirely owned by her sister. The family that had gathered to discuss my mother's estate had discovered that her true legacy wasn't just the wealth she had accumulated, but the justice she had enabled by ensuring her daughter could choose truth over family loyalty without fear of personal consequences. As I drove away from the house where I had been raised, I reflected on the transformation that had begun with my exclusion from my mother's funeral and culminated with my assumption of complete authority over my family's financial and legal future. The woman who had been deemed unworthy to attend her mother's memorial service had become the guardian of her mother's principles and the protector of her family's security. The emerald wisdom my mother had embedded in her secret empire wasn't about accumulating wealth, but about ensuring that truth and justice remained possible even when they conflicted with family harmony and personal relationships. She had given me not just financial independence, but moral independence to make decisions based on what was right rather than what was convenient. 6 months later, my father's accounting practice had been voluntarily closed, and his client base transferred to legitimate professionals who were ensuring proper tax compliance. The fraud network my mother had documented was systematically dismantled as other accountants faced the choice between ending their illegal practices or facing prosecution with evidence I could provide to investigators. Emma had accepted a promotion to executive vice president of Meridian Capital, where her inside knowledge of the company's operations proved invaluable as we expanded the firm's ethical investment strategies. The Chen Foundation had doubled its support for investigative journalism programs, funding fellowships that enabled reporters to pursue corporate corruption cases without fear of economic retaliation. My own career had evolved beyond individual reporting to include oversight of foundation grants that supported other journalists investigating the kinds of fraud my father had perpetrated. The woman who had been banned from her mother's funeral had become the guardian of her mother's mission, using inherited wealth to support the truth-telling that had characterized her career and her character. The exclusion that had seemed so devastating had actually freed me to discover the legacy my mother had carefully constructed, not just as an inheritance of money, but as an inheritance of values that could be protected and extended through carefully applied power. My mother's greatest gift hadn't been the financial security she had provided, but the moral clarity she had preserved by ensuring I could choose justice without sacrificing security. The emerald inheritance she had left wasn't measured in dollars or properties, but in the freedom to be authentically myself while protecting the principles that mattered most to both of us. The inheritance had transformed me from the family disappointment to the family protector, from the daughter whose independence was criticized to the woman whose independence enabled justice, and through it all, the mother who had been quietly dismissed as financially naive had proven to be the most sophisticated strategist any of us had ever encountered, building wealth not just for accumulation, but for transformation of her family and protection of the values she held most dear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.